They say some secrets are best kept buried, but what do you do when you're caught in the act? It wasn't just embarrassment, it was the way he looked at me, like he knew everything I'd been trying to hide. That one moment, his footsteps in the hallway, his voice breaking the silence, set off a chain of events that changed everything. I couldn't stop it, and part of me didn't want to. It started like any other day, or at least I thought it did. Life had always been predictable: wake up, go to work, come home, repeat. My world was small but stable, and I found comfort in its routine. Growing up, my brother Finn and I had shared everything: childhood secrets, silly pranks, and countless memories. He was the reliable one, the rock of our family, and I always looked up to him. After a few years of working in the city, I moved back home to save money and be closer to family. Our parents were away often, leaving just me and Finn in the house. At first, it felt like old times: late-night conversations, shared dinners, and inside jokes only the two of us understood. But something had shifted, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Finn had changed over the years. He wasn't the lanky, awkward teenager I remembered. He was taller now, his shoulders broader, his confidence effortless. There was something magnetic about the way he carried himself, and though I tried to ignore it, I found myself noticing little things I never had before. The way his laughter filled a room, the casual charm in his smile, it all felt strangely new. One evening, I was unpacking from a work trip, my room filled with the scent of lavender and old books, a comforting reminder of home. The exhaustion of long days and sleepless nights weighed on me, but it wasn't just physical. There was an ache deeper than that, a loneliness I couldn't shake. As I unpacked, Finn's voice drifted down the hallway, his guitar strumming softly in the living room. It was such a familiar sound, yet it felt different now, like it carried an unspoken question I couldn't quite answer. I shook my head, brushing away the thoughts. This was Finn, my brother. The person who'd seen me at my worst and still managed to make me laugh. But as I lay down that night, the quiet of the house wrapped around me, and my mind began to wander. Memories of our closeness, his teasing grin, and the way his presence made everything feel easier lingered far longer than they should have. It started with little things, small, insignificant moments that I could have easily ignored if they didn't stir something inside me. Finn had always been the affectionate type, quick with a joke or a hug, but lately, his presence felt different. It wasn't just the way he'd linger in the doorway when we talked or the warmth in his voice when he said my name. It was the way my heart reacted, skipping a beat when it shouldn't have. I told myself I was imagining it. He was just being Finn, playful, charming, and utterly unaware of the effect his actions were having on me. But then there were the late nights. I'd hear him in the living room, strumming his guitar softly, the melancholy notes drifting through the house. It felt as though those melodies were meant for me, calling me out of my room, tempting me to join him. One night, I did. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the lamp beside him. He looked up when I entered, his expression softening into a smile that made my stomach flip. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low, almost intimate. "No," I admitted, sitting across from him on the couch. "The quiet's too loud." He chuckled, a sound that felt like it wrapped around me. "You've always hated silence." For a while, we just sat there, the music filling the space between us. But then he set the guitar aside and leaned back, his gaze fixed on me. "What's been on your mind lately?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes probing. I hesitated. How could I tell him that he was what was on my mind? That every smile, every glance, every casual touch felt like it carried a weight I didn't know how to bear. "Just work," I lied, forcing a smile. "It's been stressful." His expression didn't change, but his eyes lingered a moment too long before he nodded. "You work too hard," he said, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from my face. The touch was brief, innocent enough, but it sent a jolt through me. I pulled back, laughing awkwardly. "You sound like Mom." He smirked, leaning back again. "Maybe I care more than you think." It was a harmless comment, something any sibling might say, but it struck a chord deep inside me. Was it my imagination, or was there something in his voice, in the way he looked at me, that suggested otherwise? I shook my head, brushing the thought away. This was Finn. My brother. Anything else was unthinkable. But unthinkable didn't mean impossible. The signs were everywhere, growing more obvious by the day. The way he'd stand a little too close when we talked, his gaze lingering when he thought I wasn't looking. The way his laughter seemed softer when it was just the two of us. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, but the more I tried to convince myself, the harder it became to ignore. One evening, as we were watching a movie together, his hand brushed against mine. It wasn't deliberate, I told myself that, but neither of us moved away. My heart raced as the seconds stretched on, the contact innocent yet electric. Finally, I pulled my hand back, pretending to adjust the blanket draped over me. He didn't say anything, but I caught the flicker of a smile on his lips, almost as if he knew. And that was the worst part. Maybe he did know. Maybe he felt it too, the pull, the tension, the unspoken questions that hung heavy between us. I told myself I was reading too much into it, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. Something had shifted between us, and no matter how much I tried to deny it, I couldn't ignore the way it made me feel. It was the way he looked at me that night, like I wasn't just his sister, but something more. I didn't want to admit it, even to myself, but that gaze had lingered long after he'd left the room. Finn wasn't acting like the boy I'd grown up with. He was confident now, self-assured, and everything about him seemed different, his voice, his demeanor, even the way he carried himself. And it was affecting me in ways I couldn't control. The tension between us had been building for weeks, each small interaction layered with something unspoken. At first, I thought I could handle it, brush it off as my imagination. But the truth became harder to ignore, especially when he started finding reasons to be close to me. One night, as I was cooking dinner, I felt him behind me. His presence was warm, solid, and just a little too close. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice low, his breath brushing against the back of my neck. I froze for a moment before stepping aside. "Sure, you can chop the vegetables," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't move, though. Instead, he reached over me to grab the knife, his arm brushing against mine. It was such a small touch, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "You're tense," he said, glancing at me out of the corner of his eye. "Long day?" I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "Something like that." We worked side by side in silence, the air between us thick with an unspoken energy. His arm would brush against mine every so often, whether by accident or on purpose, I couldn't tell. But each touch left my skin buzzing, my heart racing. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking it. But the heat that rose in my cheeks every time he looked at me said otherwise. Later that evening, as we sat on the couch watching TV, the tension reached a breaking point. We were both under the same blanket, a habit we'd always had when we were younger. But this time, it felt different. His leg brushed against mine, and neither of us moved. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to focus on the screen, but I could feel his gaze on me. "What's wrong?" he asked suddenly, his voice soft. "Nothing," I lied, refusing to look at him. He didn't believe me. I could tell by the way he shifted closer, his arm pressing against mine. "You've been quiet lately," he said. "Is it something I did?" "No," I said quickly, shaking my head. "It's not you." "Then what is it?" His voice was gentle, but there was an edge to it, a determination to get the truth out of me. When I didn't answer, he reached out, his fingers brushing against my hand. "Maya, talk to me." I finally turned to look at him, and the intensity in his eyes made my breath catch. He wasn't teasing, wasn't joking. He was serious, and the weight of his gaze felt like it was pinning me in place. I couldn't lie to him, not when he was looking at me like that. "It's nothing," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I've been in my head a lot lately." His hand tightened around mine, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. "You don't have to go through it alone, you know," he said softly. "I'm here." The sincerity in his voice broke something inside me. Tears welled in my eyes, and I looked away, ashamed of the emotions bubbling to the surface. "I know," I said, my voice trembling. "But it's not that simple." "It can be," he said, leaning closer. "If you let it." I felt his breath against my cheek, warm and steady, and my heart raced as I realized how close he was. I should have pulled away, should have stopped him, but I couldn't. My body felt frozen, caught between fear and something else, something I didn't want to name. Maya, he said, his voice a low murmur. Tell me to stop. I looked up at him, my eyes meeting his, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. I could feel the heat radiating off him, the weight of his gaze as it dropped to my lips. I should have said something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stayed silent, my breath hitching as he leaned closer. When his lips brushed against mine, it was soft at first, almost hesitant. But then the kiss deepened, and all the tension that had been building between us exploded in an instant. My hands moved to his shoulders, pulling him closer even as my mind screamed at me to stop. We were crossing a line I knew we could never come back from. But in that moment, I didn't care. All I cared about was the way his touch made me feel, the way his kiss ignited something inside me that I hadn't even realized was there. I never thought the moment would come when everything unraveled. Yet, as I stood there, the reality of what we had done hung heavy in the air, a secret so potent it felt like it was suffocating me. It was just another quiet evening, or so it seemed. Finn had come into my room, his presence as familiar as the walls that surrounded us. At first, we talked, the conversation casual, our words light. But as the minutes ticked by, the unspoken tension that had been building between us reached a boiling point. His hand brushed mine, lingering just a second too long, and my breath caught. Maya, he said softly, his voice trembling just enough to betray his nerves. We need to talk. I turned to him, my heart pounding. About what? He hesitated, his gaze searching mine. About us. The words hit me like a freight train. My mind raced, searching for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. Finn, I started, my voice shaking. There's nothing to talk about. Don't do that, he said, stepping closer. Don't pretend like this isn't happening. I wanted to deny it, to laugh it off and push him away, but the intensity in his eyes rooted me to the spot. I couldn't look away, couldn't stop the flood of emotions that came rushing in. It's not happening, I whispered, though even I didn't believe my own words. His hand reached out, his fingers brushing against my cheek. Then why does it feel like it is? I froze, my mind screaming at me to stop this, to put an end to the madness. But my body had other plans. The warmth of his touch spread through me like wildfire, and before I knew it, I was leaning into him. His lips found mine, and the world around us faded away. The kiss was electric, raw and unrestrained, and it shattered every boundary we'd ever known. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I could feel the tension in his body, the urgency in his movements. My mind screamed at me to stop, to think about what we were doing, but my heart had already made its decision. We stumbled backward, his arms wrapping around me as he guided us to the bed. The room was spinning, the air thick with the scent of him, the feel of him. My fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer as our kisses grew more desperate. Every rational thought I'd ever had was gone, replaced by a single, undeniable truth: I wanted this. I wanted him. But then the door burst open. The sound of it slamming against the wall jolted us apart, and I turned to see our mother standing in the doorway. Her eyes were wide, her face pale, and the look of shock and betrayal on her face was one I would never forget. What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice trembling. I scrambled to sit up, my face burning with shame. "Mom, I can explain." "Explain?" she snapped, her voice rising. "What could you possibly say to explain this?" Finn stood frozen beside me, his face ashen. "Mom, it's not what it looks like," he said weakly, but even he didn't sound convinced. Her gaze shifted between the two of us, her disbelief turning to anger. "I trusted you," she said, her voice breaking. "I left you two alone because I thought you were better than this." Tears filled my eyes as the weight of her words sank in. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. The room felt suffocating, the silence deafening. Finn reached for my hand, but I pulled away, the shame too much to bear. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Sorry?" Mom spat, her eyes blazing. "Do you even realize what you've done? Do you have any idea how wrong this is?" Her words cut through me like a knife, each one a painful reminder of the line we had crossed. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that it hadn't been planned, that it wasn't something we'd meant to happen. But deep down, I knew there was no excuse. "You need to leave," she said finally, her voice cold. "Both of you." Finn started to protest, but she silenced him with a glare. "Now," she said firmly. "I don't want to see either of you until I've had time to think." We didn't argue. There was no point. Finn grabbed his jacket, and I followed him out of the house, my legs feeling like lead. The night air was cool, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside me. We walked in silence for a while, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on us. Finally, Finn spoke. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for this to happen." I looked at him, my chest tightening. "Neither did I," said softly. "But it did." We found a bench and sat down, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. I wanted to blame him, to say that he'd started it, but I couldn't. The truth was, I was just as guilty. We had both let this happen, and now we were paying the price. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice raw. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "I don't know," I admitted. "But we can't go back. Not after this." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "I'll leave," he said after a moment. "Maybe if I go, Mom will forgive you." "That's not fair," I said, my voice breaking. "This isn't just your fault. We both made this mistake." He reached for my hand, and this time, I didn't pull away. "I'll figure it out," he said quietly. "I just want you to be okay." As the night wore on, we sat there in silence, the enormity of our actions sinking in. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with pain and regret, but one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The house was eerily silent the next day. Finn had left early in the morning without a word, leaving behind an empty room and a sense of heaviness that hung in the air. Mom wouldn't look at me. Her movements were stiff, her words clipped when she spoke, which was rare. It felt like the world I'd known had shattered, and I was left trying to pick up the pieces. I stayed in my room most of the day, staring at the walls, the weight of guilt pressing down on me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, the shock, the anger, the disbelief. And then there was Finn. His voice echoed in my head, the way he'd said he'd leave, as if his absence could erase the damage we'd done. By evening, Mom finally broke her silence. She knocked on my door, her presence heavy even before she stepped inside. I sat up, my heart pounding, and watched as she crossed the room, her arms folded tightly across her chest. "We need to talk," she said, her voice cold and steady. I nodded, swallowing hard. "I know." She sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes fixed on the floor. For a long moment, she didn't speak, and I wondered if she was searching for the right words or simply trying to contain her anger. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were filled with something that cut deeper than her words ever could: disappointment. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "How could you let this happen?" Her question hung in the air, and I struggled to find an answer. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. It wasn't supposed to happen." "But it did," she said sharply. "And now we're here. Do you have any idea what this could do to our family? To your relationship with Finn? To me?" I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. She was right. I hadn't thought about the consequences, not really. In the moment, it had felt impossible to think beyond the way he made me feel. But now, the weight of it all was crashing down around me. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Her expression softened slightly, but the pain in her eyes didn't fade. "Sorry doesn't fix this, Maya. Sorry doesn't make it go away." "I know," I said, my voice barely audible. "I know." For the next hour, she talked, and I listened. She didn't yell or scream, but her words were heavy with the kind of disappointment that felt worse than any punishment. She told me how I'd broken her trust, how she couldn't look at me without thinking of what I'd done. It was a conversation I'd never imagined having, and by the time she left, I felt like a shell of the person I'd been. Days turned into weeks, and life didn't get any easier. Finn stayed away, his absence a constant reminder of everything we'd lost. Mom and I barely spoke, the distance between us growing with each passing day. I went through the motions of daily life, but everything felt hollow. The worst part was the guilt. It was like a shadow, following me everywhere I went. It crept into my thoughts during the quiet moments, wrapping around my heart and squeezing until I could barely breathe. I replayed that night over and over, wondering where I could have stopped it, what I could have done differently. But the truth was, I'd let it happen. I'd crossed the line, and now I was paying the price. Eventually, Finn reached out. It was a simple text, "We need to talk." My hands trembled as I typed my response, agreeing to meet him at a small cafe on the edge of town. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew we couldn't avoid each other forever. When I walked in, he was already there, sitting at a table in the corner. He looked different, tired, older somehow. When he saw me, he gave a small, hesitant smile, and my heart ached at the sight of him. "Hi," I said, sliding into the seat across from him. "Hi," he replied, his voice soft. For a moment, we just sat there, the silence stretching between us. Finally, he spoke. "I'm sorry for leaving like that." I shook my head. "You didn't have a choice." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I hate that things ended up like this. I hate that I hurt you, that I hurt Mom." "It wasn't just you," I said quickly. "We're both responsible for what happened." "I know," he said, his voice heavy. "But I can't stop thinking about it. About you." His words hung in the air, and I felt the weight of them settle over me. "Finn," I said, my voice trembling. We can't do this." "I know," he said again, his gaze dropping to the table. "But it doesn't change how I feel." We sat there for hours, talking about everything and nothing. By the time we left, it was clear that things between us would never go back to the way they were. The bond we'd shared as siblings was fractured, and while we both wanted to move forward, the scars of what had happened would always remain. In the months that followed, life began to settle into a new normal, though it was far from the life I had known before. Finn moved out of the house completely, finding a small apartment on the other side of town. We spoke occasionally, texts here, a call there, but the easy closeness we once shared was gone. There was an unspoken agreement between us. The past was off limits. Mom and I worked hard to rebuild our relationship, though it was clear things would never be the same. The trust we'd lost was a wound that healed slowly, and even then, it left a scar. She tried to forgive me. I could see it in the way she would start a sentence but then stop, as if unsure how to proceed. I wanted to believe that one day, the guilt in her eyes and in mine would fade, but I knew it wasn't something that could be rushed. The hardest part, though, was forgiving myself. I'd always thought of myself as a good person, someone who made mistakes but never crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. But this was different. I had crossed a boundary I never even considered before, and it had changed the way I saw myself. Every day, I had to wrestle with the consequences of my actions, the choices I'd made in a moment of weakness. Therapy helped. I started seeing someone a few weeks after everything happened, a counselor who listened without judgment and helped me unravel the tangled mess of emotions I was carrying. Shame, regret, confusion, it all spilled out during those sessions. She helped me see that while I couldn't erase the past, I could learn from it. That forgiveness, even self-forgiveness, was possible, but it required work. One day, during one of our sessions, she asked me a question that stayed with me long after I'd left her office. "What do you want your life to look like moving forward?" The answer wasn't immediate, but over time, it began to take shape. I wanted to rebuild trust with my family, with myself. I wanted to find a way to live without the weight of the past dragging me down. I wanted to move forward, not forget what had happened but learn from it, let it guide me to make better choices. Finn seemed to be finding his own path as well. From what little he shared, he was seeing someone, a woman he'd met at work, and trying to focus on his future. It hurt, knowing that he was moving on while I still felt stuck, but it also gave me hope. If he could find peace, maybe I could too. Over time, the pain dulled. It didn't disappear, but it became easier to carry. I found new routines, new goals, and new ways to remind myself that I was more than the sum of my mistakes. And in those quiet moments, when the memories threatened to pull me under, I reminded myself that healing wasn't linear. Some days would be harder than others, but that didn't mean I wasn't moving forward. Looking back, I realized that what happened was more than just a mistake, it was a wake-up call. It forced me to confront parts of myself I'd ignored for too long, my insecurities, my loneliness, my need for connection. And while I wouldn't wish the experience on anyone, it taught me lessons I could never forget. Now, as I sit here reflecting on everything, I know one thing for sure: life goes on. It isn't always easy, and it isn't always fair, but it does move forward. And with each day that passes, I'm learning to let go of the guilt and embrace the person I want to become. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that even in the wake of mistakes, there's room for growth and hope. Let me know when you're ready for the call to action segment. What would you do if faced with a choice that could destroy everything you hold dear? Could you forgive yourself or those you love? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. Trust me, you won't believe what's coming next. It's even more shocking than this one.